Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to be able to introduce this session of the Asia Scotland Institute, working with the Brookings Institute in Washington, on what is, as everybody will realize, an extremely important topic, a critical subject, which is key to engaging with Asia. The growth of criminal activity is prevalent, and we have two extremely able professionals discussing that with us today. Vanda felbab-brown is a senior fellow in the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence in the Foreign Policy Program at Brookings, and she's an expert on international and internal conflicts and non-traditional security threats, including insurgency, organized crime, urban violence, and illicit economies. Martin Perbrick, who at one time was the director of the Asia Scotland Institute, is a consultant, analyst, and writer who spent 32 years working in Asia in corporate risk management, law enforcement, and sports integrity. And he now writes for journals and news publications, including published work in Asian Affairs, the Jamestown Foundation, the Scotsman, and the South China Morning Post. He was director of security and integrity for the Hong Kong Jockey Club, and was responsible for integrity management and corruption, anti-money laundering, financial crime investigations, customer due diligence, and security risk management, as well as having served with the Hong Kong police. So two very able participants today, and it's with the greatest of pleasure that I will ask Martin if he could very kindly start the conversation.
Roddy, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to talk to you again, and really a privilege to be in conversation with Vanda, who I would say is a world leader in this subject. So I intend to learn more from this today. But if I could just give the opening to this and set the scene perhaps, to talk about what is Chinese organized crime, first of all, because I think there are a lot of misconceptions around the world, especially with the unease about the growth of China at the moment. So it's probably best to try to explain what we're talking about with Chinese organized crime. So firstly, defining organized crime, which is planned and coordinated criminal activities by people working together on a continuing basis. Quite straightforward. And Chinese crime is obviously the Chinese equivalent of that, involving Chinese nationals. But crime in China and crime outside China by Chinese nationals is complicated because organized crime and secret societies in China were largely eradicated after the Communist Revolution in 1949 in mainland China itself. However, Chinese organized crime has certainly thrived in the second half of the 20th century, especially outside of mainland China, in particular, in those areas which were not under Chinese communist control. Obviously, Hong Kong under British rule, Macau under Portuguese rule, and Taiwan under Kuomintang or nationalist Chinese rule. In all three of those locations, triad societies and various Chinese organized crime groups have prospered, whereas in the mainland, they have not. However, I think we have to differentiate a little bit between what we're talking about in terms of people and organizations. Not all Chinese criminals are triads, but generally speaking, all triads are criminals because triads are secret societies, and by their very nature, they tend to engage in criminal activities. We have to dispel some of the myths about triads, I think. Triad society is an English word that was given by Europeans to Chinese secret societies during the Qing dynasty. There are a lot of myths and legends about triads. They're largely foundation myths. And the main foundation myth is that the triad society originally was founded in opposition to the Manchu Qing dynasty in the 17th century. And a series of factions or other societies grew from it. In reality, and I would suggest reading the work of Professor Dian Murray, who studied the imperial archives in Taiwan, triad societies and secret societies were more often mutual aid societies, tied to periodic rebellions, peasant-stricken peasants, etc. So the foundation myth about opposing the Qing, restoring the Ming dynasty is claptrap, really. But to the present day, some triads have used that as part of their foundation myth to try and show their patriotic origins. And obviously with the Chinese Communist Party being essentially a nationalist party, being patriotic towards China means supporting the Chinese Communist Party. And the Communist Party has made use of that. So from 1949, triads were largely eradicated in the mainland. So crackdowns in China are nothing new. The communists use crackdowns on all sorts of activity through various campaigns, and that's been going on since 1949. But in Hong Kong and Macau, they prospered because of the British and colonial rule, Portuguese colonial rule, and some tolerance of them. It wasn't just not understanding them. In some degree, they were tolerated, and that's complicated. In Taiwan, they were also tolerated, and to some extent, encouraged, because the Kuomintang used triad societies, in particular the United Bamboo Gang, Bong, for its own ends. For example, the murder of Taiwanese national Henry Liu in California in 1980s, I think, was by Kuomintang triads who were working for military intelligence in Taiwan. So it's a very complicated scene, and it remains complicated to this day. So what's happened in the first part of the 21st century? It's become even more complicated, I think. We've seen Chinese organized crime groups and some triad societies. As I said, I would differentiate between them, they're not all the same, have started to expand more quickly, starting from parts of Southeast Asia, but increasingly on a globalized basis, and which I'm sure Vanda will come on to with some of the global activities shortly. I think that's been partly facilitated by the expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative. That's contributed to the growth of Chinese business people going out into the world, and Chinese criminality going with it. So if we think back to the opening up of China under Deng Xiaoping, the first stage of economic opening was welcoming in, basically welcoming in Western investment. Then from 2001, when China joined the World Trade Organization, Chinese companies and business people were increasingly encouraged to be going out to the world. So that we're talking about a several decades long process of more Chinese people, more Chinese companies going out to the world. And obviously this has included Chinese criminals seeking business opportunities. I think that started in particular in countries in Southeast Asia. I would highlight the Philippines, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam, Myanmar, where obviously in close proximity to mainland China, where Chinese criminals, Chinese business people went out to make money, invest, when they were able to travel outside of the country. So from 2010 onwards, there were large hubs of Chinese criminal activity in parts of Southeast Asia, especially the Philippines. The Philippines became a major hub, especially under the rule of Duterte when he was president in the Philippines. From 2018 onwards, there was some pressure in the Philippines against some of those Chinese organized crime groups to displace them from the Philippines. That's displaced some, but not all, and there remain some pretty large Chinese groups operating casinos, online gambling, online fraud in the Philippines, obviously facilitated by high levels of corruption there. There's further displacement from around 2022. So a lot of those criminal groups from the Philippines moved on to Cambodia and Laos, to some extent Vietnam, where it was easier to operate. But under pressure from the Chinese authorities around 2022, the Cambodian authorities cracked down on Chinese organized crime groups in that country. And if you've seen pictures or videos of Sihanoukville in Cambodia, huge growth from around 2015 onwards, major property boom, construction boom, loads of casinos all over the place, operated by Chinese groups and largely for Chinese people as well. From 2022, there was a crackdown on that, and these groups were displaced again. I think that's what enforcement action does against organized crime groups. There's a displacement, but there's not a destruction of organized crime groups by enforcement action. So Myanmar was the next destination for some of those organized crime groups that were Chinese, just shifting their operations from Cambodia. And what we've seen in the past 3 years especially, but it's been developing for a little bit longer, is what are essentially crime factories in border areas of Myanmar. Obviously, Myanmar is in the middle of a civil war, and parts of the country are controlled by different factions, either the military government or various ethnic warlords. These crime factories obviously pay either the government or the warlords who tolerate them or operate them in collaboration. And they involve trafficking in people who are tricked into going there, thinking they have jobs to go to, from all around Asia. Huge numbers of people, estimates by the United Nations of at least 100,000, probably far more, essentially to work in modern slavery or bondage in some of these criminal factories. Industrial scale fraud, which has been endemic across Asia, but I think is increasingly touching the rest of the world as well. Online betting, online gambling, and online sexual services. It's been well reported on in Asia, perhaps less well reported on in the West. But I think the main outcome of this is huge revenue growth for some of these groups. And so they're cash rich. There's some pressure on some of those entities in Myanmar now because the Chinese authorities do react. As we were discussing earlier, Roddy, I think the Chinese authorities are usually quite late to react to a problem because they often don't understand it. That's not deliberately allowing a problem. It's just that under the Chinese system, the communist system, problems are not easily reported up. No one wants to give bad news to Beijing because that suggests that the top-down dictatorial system has failed. It's quite difficult for central government often to understand the nature of problems. But coming out of this criminal growth in Southeast Asia, in Myanmar, narcotics trafficking has boomed. And that's partly because of the success of the Taliban in Afghanistan in suppressing the production of opium and hence the supply of opium. And that supply has moved across to Myanmar, which has picked up the demand. Also online fraud, online gambling, which I mentioned. That is a several $1 trillion industry. The returns are stupendous, literally several trillions of dollars in revenue. And that picked up during the pandemic. And then I think what we have is this huge revenue stream for organized crime groups and the need to deal with that by dealing with the proceeds of crime, money laundering. How do you launder these huge proceeds that are coming from organized crime groups? That's also developed on a global basis because being cash rich, a lot of these Chinese groups have gone out to other parts of the world and are engaged in either direct criminal activities themselves or collaboration with other groups or providing money laundering services. And perhaps I could stop there, sort of setting the scene, I hope, of where organized crime has come from in China and around China, and hand over to you to ask Vanda what's happening in the rest of the world.
Thanks. I got one question for you there, and that is in the UK, are the police and related services in the UK on top of this?
I would have to say no, and I say that having heard the same message from friends in the police here, and there's a very simple reason for that. Because it's complicated. It involves transnational organized crime involves other ethnic and cultural groups who speak different languages. So the authorities in Britain, and I'm sure in the US as well, are dealing with multiple transnational groups, Albanians, Kosovans, Italians traditionally, Chinese, Vietnamese, think of the
Russian, I would think,
Russian, etc. Yeah. If you're a policing organization, that's suddenly incredibly complex to deal with. The linguistic translation resources you need to understand what people are doing, intercept communications, etc., interview people, run live sources, incredibly complex. And that's why in the UK, I think it's fair to say, without being critical, they're not on top of it, but they need to better understand it.
Martin, thank you. And you rightly described Vanda as being one of the world's leading experts in this field. And Vanda, we are absolutely delighted that you're with us, and perhaps I could turn the subject over to you now.
Well, thank you very much, Roddy and Martin, for the invitation. It's a great pleasure to be back with the Asia-Scotland Institute, and thank you very much for your kind characterization that only sets me up to possibly fail after your way too generous comments. And, you know, Martin just did a superb overview of the evolution and core characteristics of Chinese organized crime, and did so, of course, with the historic sweep that Chinese scholars, Chinese officials come to thinking about policy, come to thinking about diplomatic issues, and leaving me with the Western amateurism that just picks up the last decade, where they think about several centuries of evolutions and trends. So let me pick perhaps several themes that Martin highlighted and think with you today about where Chinese organized crime is. And let me reiterate the complexity of organized crime. So absolutely, there are still entities that are called in popular parlance in the West, the triads. Actors such as 14K, that are some of the most powerful organized crime groups in the world and are engaged in the whole variety of criminal activities, something that I will come to in a minute. On the other hand, part of the spectrum of criminal groups originated in China, operating in China and Southeast Asia or other parts of the world, are much smaller entities, often family-based networks that have one foot in legal enterprise and one foot in illegal enterprises. Unlike in a place like Mexico, for example, or actually in Colombia, where, you know, for a long time we would think of the Medellin cartel, the Cali cartel, so two very dominant groups and perhaps a set of smaller actors. In China, you have a great diversity and complexity of actors that are involved in illegal activity, but often also have a relationship with the Chinese Communist Party, Chinese government, and have relationship with businesses. And this is a very important factor that complicates law enforcement issues. You know, Martin mentioned the extent to which the government in China, at least until the opening of China to the West in the 80s, was effective in turning off potent and certainly violent organized crime. And indeed, what distinguishes China and East Asia more broadly is how very powerful organized crime groups involved in a wide variety of illegal economies are nonviolent. So if you look at homicide levels perpetrated by organized crime, as well as in general, in East Asia, in China, we're looking at very low digits. 1 per 100,000, 2 per 100,000, less than 1 per 100,000. Whereas in Latin America, in the context of the same amount of drug trafficking, same amount of drug consumption, perhaps lesser than even in East Asia, and very powerful organized crime groups, we're routinely talking about high tens, high upper digits for homicides rate. And this has to a large extent to do with the power that law enforcement institutions in East Asia, in China, have vis-a-vis criminal groups. That's very strikingly different than is the case in Latin America. So there are real differences in behavior, but there are not that many substantial differences in the amount of activity that criminal and types of illicit economies that criminal groups in East Asia, and including Chinese criminal groups, are involved in. So Martin highlighted several of the traditional domains, the casinos, the gambling that have moved online, and of course today cybercrime, scam, pig butchering, new forms of scams that are operated in East Asia, often by Chinese criminal groups, on really an industrial scale. So the domain might not be new, but the methods and the industrial production of that part of that form of crime is certainly a major evolution, if not a revolution. But of course, Chinese criminal groups are involved in a whole variety of other illegal economies. Drug trafficking is one of the most important ones. Methamphetamine in East Asia is dominated by powerful Chinese organized crime groups. 14K, Semgor are some of the most powerful drug trafficking groups. They, about a decade and a half ago, they used to produce methamphetamine in southern China. when President Xi came to office, he initiated a set of actions to crack down on a whole variety of organized crime in China. This was motivated by a variety of factors, but one of which was eliminating any form of power, any pole of power that would not be directly linked to him. And you have historically, including in the 80s, 90s, and across the 2000s, across the 21st century, a managed relationship between crime and law enforcement, between crime and the Chinese Communist Party. So when Xi comes to power, he rips through criminal markets in China in an extraordinary way that would be quite difficult for many a Western country to pull off. And this both shapes the pattern of criminal groups, it realigns their affinities, but it also starts the process, or further expands the process that Martin was talking about, of shifting Chinese organized crime groups to establish important bases abroad. And you see the production operations in the methamphetamine production operations in southern China shutting down, but the networks not being dismantled, moving their operations to Myanmar, where they would develop partnerships, arrangements with actors like United Wa State Army. But while the production would be centered in Myanmar now, and in various parts also in Thailand, the key operators would remain the very same Chinese organized crime groups that really have the dominant role in methamphetamine trafficking in Southeast Asia and into Asia, into the Pacific region, Australia and New Zealand. Now, just so that we're speaking about drug trafficking, there is several really fascinating developments are taking place now. One of which is the expansion of Mexican cartels, Sinaloa and Jalisco, into the Australia and New Zealand markets, highly desirable markets because fast profits. And while we have essentially 2 decades of collaborative but very limited relations between actors like the Sinaloa cartel and powerful Hong Kong and China-based or Hong Kong and China-originated drug trafficking groups, all of a sudden the expansion of the Mexicans into the Australia, New Zealand markets puts them in a direct clash with the triads, with the groups that have dominated methamphetamine trafficking there. So one fascinating dimension to watch is how that will alter the relationship between them. Will it? Are we going to see explosion in violence, at least through local proxies, not directly by the two groups in that area? But on the flip side of the spectrum is far greater collaboration between the Mexican cartels and other large, powerful criminal groups and Chinese organized crime groups. And that is specifically in both drug trafficking, but also in money laundering that Martin spoke about. So let me talk about the collaboration in drug trafficking. This is in the delivery of precursor chemicals for methamphetamine and for fentanyl production, synthetic opioids production to Mexican cartels. Now, that is, however, a very important nuance. I mentioned that methamphetamine production in Asia and trafficking in Asia is dominated by the very powerful groups, 14K, these type of large actors. The value that is generated by the sale of precursors is very limited. It's a tiny fraction of the profits and the revenues achieved through full methamphetamine production and trade. And so the set of actors that are involved in precursor delivery to the Mexican cartel is much wider. Many of them are not the really big, powerful groups, are not the 14K. I mean, they might be involved, but many are much smaller family-based operations that when they are exposed and indicted in places like the United States are labeled by the name of the individual who is the head of the patriarch of the family, the Zhang cartel. Not name that you will hear beyond that specific indictment. And so the one serious complication for law enforcement and in fact also for the relations between the Chinese and the Mexican cartels is that the panoply of actors involved in the precursor trafficking to operations in Europe to operations in the United States is much wider. There's just much wider set of actors operating. The other, however, very important dimension is the rise of Chinese money laundering networks that are now servicing organized crime globally. So much so that they have really become the to-go money launderers for the Sinaloa cartel, for large Mexican groups. They have burst onto the scene in the United States, in Europe, in a way that had the massive growth over the past 10 years, displacing long-established criminal actors in money laundering or services in money laundering, such as the black peso market. Now, why is that happen? What gives a Chinese money laundering network this unique power? Well, one is experience. Places like Australia and New Zealand have long been used, and parts of Southeast Asia, Macau, Hong Kong, have long been used for laundering money that has come from organized crime in China. But the 2015 capital control laws in China that set the limit on how much money can be taken out of China has essentially created the situation where vast sectors of society, businesses, individuals that do not normally operate in illegal economies now have a need to find a way to get money out. And so this has created this vast underground Chinese banking system that is equivalent, say, to the Hawala system, evading both the formal banking system and consequently also the money laundering regulations oversight that has been built into it. But because there is this vast demand for this informal banking system, Chinese money laundering networks have essentially captive audience. They have captive demand, a vast scale way beyond what organized crime alone can do. And consequently, they can offer rates to the Mexican cartels, to the Nandareta, to the mafia groups that are difficult to beat for all other money launderers, since they can simply put the costs on their Chinese captive demand. Now, let me, in conclusion, just highlight other activities that we can talk about where Chinese organized crime is involved. We see vast expansion beyond Asia, into Latin America, into Africa, frankly, into North America. In what ways Chinese organized crime groups engage with other criminal groups in those areas is highly varied. The relations in Chile and Argentina between actors that are referred to as the Chinese mafia or the Fujian mafia are very different than the relations Chinese organized crime groups have with Mexican cartels. A lot of has to do with the power that their local criminal groups have, how the criminal market looks before the Chinese emerge there. They, however, frequently do tap Chinese diasporas that might have been part of this scene for decades and decades, that have the dual language skills that are often a challenge for law enforcement. They come on the heels, on the tail of legal businesses and legal activities, so illegal fishing, illegal mining, wildlife trafficking, resource extraction are all very much part of the domain of Chinese organized crime. But at the same time, of course, you have large Chinese businesses acting illegally, using corruption, overriding local regulations, ignoring local regulation. So you have illegal activity perpetrated by Chinese actors that are not organized crime groups, that are your major companies simply behaving in a dirty way and ignoring local laws. And these connections between them and Chinese crime also then runs into the fact that China has often a very managed relationship with criminal groups. On the one hand, China loves to present itself as the world's toughest drug cop in domains like drug trafficking. And every year you will hear statistics of hundreds of tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands of China being arrested and indicted on a whole variety of criminal charges. But at the same time, China tends to act against criminal groups only when they that operate outside of China only when they cross certain red lines for the Chinese Communist Party. And as long as the big powerful groups provide services in terms of building corruption networks, in terms of developing influence among political and business actors in other countries, in terms of being informal eyes on the diaspora, informal enforcers against the diaspora, as long as they provide a whole variety of services for the Chinese Communist Party and for the Chinese government, there are limits of how far China goes against them. And it would take direct threat to the Chinese government or highly visible violence against Chinese citizens or enormous diplomatic pressure that triggers crackdown, but a crackdown that is often quite limited and doesn't go all the way to dismantle these networks. With that, Roddy, let me hand it over to you.
Well, thank you very much. That was, as expected, extremely interesting. I'd be interested if you could comment on what's going on in Africa, which of course is which you know well. There's the wildlife trafficking business, but in terms of other crime that China's involved with, would you have anything to say on that?
Sure. So, Africa, like Latin America, features a spectrum of operations by Chinese organized crime or by Chinese actors that act illegally. So it is certainly wildlife trafficking, where we have Chinese network established over several decades now that have become much more sophisticated. So, 20 years ago, you would have Chinese organized crime groups having one layer in the wildlife trafficking domain in Africa and directly interacting with local communities or at least local brokers. Today, you often have 3 or 4 layers of local brokers across several African countries that are underneath the Chinese organized crime element. And the Chinese organized crime element is just much more diversified and much more insulated from immediate instigation of criminality like wildlife trafficking, even as the network is operated by very powerful Chinese organized crime groups. And so in contrast to the Vietnamese are just much closer to the ground because they haven't had the maturation and the sophistication that these networks have been able to achieve. You also have vast presence in illegal fishing, illegal mining and extraction and timber. But once again, you have a lot of criminal actions committed by large Chinese businesses that because of corruption, because of exceptions from rule of enforcement, are able to ignore local laws and engage in illegal extractive activity. What is also interesting about Africa, and it's the flip side of the expansion of Chinese criminal activity abroad, is that China is also very determined and much more expansive to be exporting Chinese law enforcement assistance abroad. And we most dramatically see it in the Pacific Islands, Marshall Islands, etc. But China is actively trying to establish both informal and formal policing assistance arrangements with African countries, with Latin American countries, that at the beginning centered on exporting Chinese surveillance technologies and smart and safe cities, for example, type technologies, but more and more, in fact, involve the installation of Chinese officers, perhaps even Chinese police stations, and providing assistance with grave concerns about human rights and how these could be leveraged for espionage as well.
Thank you very much. Martin, perhaps you'd like to comment on what Wanda has said, and also I know that we're beginning to get some messages in the Q&A function, which you might like to talk about as well. But your reaction, Martin, to what you've heard.
Yes, absolutely. And perhaps just to lead on, to follow on from Vanda's comments on money laundering, as Vanda said, it's a complex arena, and to some extent, Chinese money laundering has some similarities to the Hawala system, which I think law enforcement agencies have studied for some decades and had a better understanding of, and now need to gain a better understanding of this growing Chinese underground banking system, which is rooted in obviously language and ethnic links between people, and law enforcement organizations need to map those links, and that's quite difficult. So I think I'd echo those points from Vanda, but also to sort of follow on to then what does that mean for money laundering globally? Because I think we have a question from Ewan, who has asked about where do Dubai, Singapore, and Mauritius fit in, and what links, if any, are there with other groups? So as a follow-on in answer to that, for Ewan's question, I don't think it's just those locations that are hubs or centers for money laundering. Chinese money laundering is apparent everywhere. And there are some very good examples recently. I think the case in Singapore, pursued by the Singapore police, which is going through the courts at the moment, involving dealing with the proceeds of crime, money laundering, of at least $3 billion US. And it's a great case by the Singapore police. And it's rather a young set of individuals in the syndicate in Singapore, Chinese individuals who all have foreign passports, but most of them are from Fujian province originally, but rather young, which suggests that they're just the people laundering the proceeds. And what they're doing is buying stuff. So in Singapore, that syndicate bought over 100 landed properties, apartments, houses, etc., including some very expensive ones in the most expensive parts of Singapore. Huge amounts of cash that they've been moving into different currencies. And the Singapore police have produced some terrific photographs of safes full of that cash. Expensive wine, handbags, luxury watches, other jewelry, even collectible items such as bear bricks, which I had to ask my kids what bear bricks are. But I think the interesting thing that case shows is money laundering is increasingly complicated. So they're not just buying a single product or placing money into banks and trying to get into the financial system. It's extremely complicated and going through multiple jurisdictions and hubs. So in answer to Ewan, I would say it's everywhere. And the problem that that's showing is that this global anti-money laundering system that we have, which is hugely expensive, doesn't work. And there are a number of anti-money laundering compliance experienced specialists, I would say, perhaps not the younger ones, who are starting to question this. Why are we spending so many billions of dollars on anti-money laundering compliance systems that probably reduce the value or the quality of services given to ordinary customers in the banking system, but aren't stopping necessarily organized crime groups, such as those Chinese organized crime groups, from dealing with the proceeds of crime? So it's not just law enforcement organizations that need to better understand this growth and diversity of criminality, but the banking system as well, because what they're doing at the moment isn't working.
If I can just pick up on that, excellent points by Martin, and certainly there are very many new methods by which organized crime can be laundering money. There is a lot of focus on crypto, on private money exchange system, but trade-based money laundering is one of the most frequently used and very, very difficult for law enforcement to crack. So we're seeing some of the very same patterns, Martin, you were speaking about with the Singapore case in the United States. People increasingly appearing in banks with extraordinarily high quality Chinese fake passports, setting up limited accounts for a very short amount of time, often just cashing a cashier check or being depositing small amount of money that are then withdrawn in the form of a cashier check, and was purchases of iPhones that are then brought to China. So a lot of the Chinese money laundering through either mirror images within banking systems in the United States, in China, in Mexico, in Italy, avoid international wire transfers, which are of high focus of anti-money laundering systems, but sometimes avoid the financial system altogether and are conducted through precisely the purchases of customer goods that are very much desired in China. Now, there is also an interesting dimension worth reflecting on regarding China's law enforcement collaboration with other countries. So I mentioned how China was increasingly very focused on expanding its influence in Africa, in Latin America, in the Pacific Islands. And and presenting itself as offering far more effective law enforcement assistance than the West has been able to do, but using that law enforcement assistance to extend its political and diplomatic influence. And that's because China subordinates its law enforcement cooperation to its geostrategic objectives. It does not set it aside as a technical cop-to-cop enterprise. Law enforcement assistance is a function of Chinese other purposes. So with countries whom China seeks to court, whom it wants to bring into its orbit, with whom it has good relations, it offers law enforcement assistance, but often that law enforcement assistance turns out a bit of a one-way street. We want you to be going after this Chinese money. We want you to be going after these Chinese assets. Maybe we will not extend full reciprocity as to the crime you are interested in. We will be limited in what kind of intelligence, what kind of payback we give you back. So China has made a major push in demanding compliance and cooperation from countries in Southeast Asia with Chinese anti-money laundering efforts that predominantly center on repatriating money from China that China believes has been taken out illegally, that has been taken out in violation of the capital controls. The same with the Australian government. China, however, has not been willing often to extend that same amount of anti-money laundering and financial forensic intelligence to their counterparts on the Chinese tribes, on the Semgor actors, on the 14K and other group actors. And we are in a moment right now in China-US relations that we can speak about, where China has for the first time promised a more two-way anti-money laundering cooperation. I'm not holding my breath of how long it will last, how robust it will be, but at least temporarily, there is some willingness in China to collaborate with the United States on money laundering, even though that's a domain that China would previously be denying to the United States.
Thank you very much. Martin, would you like to just focus on some questions about fentanyl? And then after your view on that, perhaps Vanda could speak as well.
Yes, and I think that follows on well from what Vanda was just saying, Roddy, in terms of collaboration with Chinese law enforcement agencies, because there are decent police officers in China. Not everyone is a political parachutnik or cadre. There are some good police officers, many of whom I've met and worked with over the years. But it's increasingly difficult or impossible to collaborate with Chinese law enforcement agencies, I think, from any Western agency. As Vanda said, the increasing links between the Public Security Bureau or Ministry of Public Security and certain countries, such as in the Pacific Islands, are for political reasons, and it's a one-way street. For Western law enforcement agencies, how can we respond to requests from China for extradition when quite often those requests relate to cases that are politically motivated? So it's very difficult to engage with Chinese law enforcement at all, despite the fact there may be some decent people in the system. And I think that is part of the problem with fentanyl, which obviously is a massive curse in North America at the moment. And the number of people dying is staggering, and the effect it's having on drug users and addicts. And the images are shocking also. So where is that coming from? And I think part of the problem originated that China is the workshop of the world. So you have been able to buy almost anything from China, and the West to a large extent has relied on this huge supply of goods, especially from China. And part of those goods, i.e. buying anything, has involved buying chemicals for drugs, precursor chemicals, some of those precursor chemicals that are not necessarily illegal or prohibited. So to some extent, there's some fairness in what the Chinese authorities have said that not all of the precursors for fentanyl are prescribed in China. But of course, any responsible government and law enforcement agency would want to curtail that supply in collaboration with the region or country where the problem is, which is North America. And that collaboration isn't there. it noticeably worsened or dropped off a cliff after Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. Whatever Nancy Pelosi's reasons for doing so, that visit had a huge impact on relations between China and the US. And if you're in the Public Security Bureau and you're told by someone in the Ministry of Public Security, don't do anything with anyone outside the country from now on, then you follow that order. So there has been no collaboration, and there's been this supply of precursor chemicals for fentanyl that has been readily available. And if you look at Chinese websites to buy stuff for drugs, it's an extraordinary range of things you can buy quite openly. And it is quite difficult to curtail that. So I think collaboration with the Chinese authorities is difficult to impossible, but has to be built on, despite our huge political differences and the differences in how they go about things. If we have zero collaboration, we will have zero progress on some of the issues that we really have to address, in particular narcotics trafficking and the fentanyl problem, which I know Vanda has written a great deal about as well.
Vanda, would you like to comment on that?
Sure. Let me a little bit expand on what Martin said in terms of the background where we are today, but also I think some of the issues to watch as we go ahead. Fentanyl is just a form of synthetic opioid. Is part and parcel of a global synthetic drugs revolution sweeping the world that is radically changing organized crime markets and sometimes not always actors involved in them. And it's in fact also radically changing foreign policies of many countries. And more of that is yet to come. Fentanyl is a drug that is used in medicine all the time. It's an extremely powerful analgesic and a very important analgesic used in many surgeries and used for people with critical pain in oncology with patients with cancers. We don't want a world without fentanyl. But what happened about 2 decades ago is that the methods of synthesizing fentanyl were simplified to a level that it was much easier for non-industrial, illicit, or small operations to be synthesizing fentanyl. And this change in the method coincided with the explosion of opioid substance use disorder in the United States. And so in about 2012, 2013, you have Chinese entrepreneurs who now have the ability to synthesize fentanyl in ways far simpler, far faster, far easier, starting to ship finished fentanyl directly to the United States, to dealers, to traders, sometimes directly to customers through the postal services. Well, why can they do it, and why don't you see that with cocaine or with heroin? Well, this is because synthetic opioids, the fentanyl class of synthetic opioids or the nitazene class of fentanyl opioids, are so potent that the amounts necessary are tiny fractions on what would be necessary to supply that same amount of market with heroin. So all of a sudden, using drones to fly across the US-Mexico border, using postal services to mail fentanyl is feasible, which you don't do with cocaine. You cannot do it with any cost efficiency. So starting around 2012, 2013, 2014, traders in China start shipping full finished fentanyl to the United States. And the United States start engaging with China. And because fentanyl is so potent, it is enormously deadly. The North America, not just the US, but Canada, North America, and Mexico are going through the most lethal drug epidemic ever in history. In the US alone, we have 300 people dying a day, 110,000 people, the vast majority of death being caused by fentanyl overdose. It's unprecedented with respect to other drugs. And we are seeing also a rise in methadone deaths that are not just linked to a mixture of methadone and fentanyl because of the evolution toward far greater potency of drugs. So, but back to the story. So the shipping of fentanyl sets of death rates in the US that are radically different than we have seen. And so the United States starts engaging with China to stop the supply of fentanyl. And finally, after years of work, China in 19 in the May 1st, 2019, schedules the entire class of fentanyl type drugs. And the shipping of direct fentanyl from China to the US falls off, just goes more than 90% down. Now, what happens instead is that Chinese criminal actors and Chinese legal businesses, indifferent to laws, start shipping precursor chemicals to Mexican cartels that then synthesize fentanyl in Mexico and bring it to the US. And yes, it is true that some of these precursor chemicals are not scheduled. They are not regulated. Many are so dual use that will never be scheduled. They are very basic chemicals used in ordinary chemistry, pharmaceutical industry, chemical industry, agricultural industry. But many of the sales, the vast majority of the sales from China knowingly supply Mexican and other criminal groups. And so China today is saying, look, we cannot act against those actors because they are selling legal chemicals we don't regulate and no one in the world regulates. And the United States says, yes, but your companies are selling these chemicals knowingly to Mexican cartels with recipes. This is how you cook fentanyl from them. They are selling them with advertisements saying, we know how to overcome law enforcement barriers. We know how to overcome customs. Come ship to us. So the US position is this should be activity that Chinese law enforcement acts on because it's direct material support, conspiracy, fraud type activities. And the Chinese government has been saying, no, we cannot act because these chemicals are not scheduled. So just one other word about where we are in the cooperation. So I mentioned that in 2019, China scheduled, after years of US pressure, the entire class of fentanyl type drugs. And why did China do it? China did it because it expected specific diplomatic payoffs from the United States. The scheduling took place at the end of the Trump administration, and China hoped that this would then motivate the Trump administration to remove the tariffs that it has placed on Chinese goods. The Trump administration didn't do it. It continued going on with the tariff war. China then waited into the first year of the Biden administration, hoping that we would have radically improved relations between China and the US. And instead, the opposite has happened. The Biden administration not only kept the tariff war, which President Biden is just about to expand tomorrow, but also pushed the strategic competition to a wide set of other domains: military alliances, emerging technologies, sensitive technologies, level of restrictions and competitions with China that we haven't seen in decades. Kind of moving, breaking the hope that the West, the US has retained, that we would have collaborative rise of China within the international system, rather now overt US definition of the relationship as one of strategic competition. So China doesn't get the payoffs from the Trump administration it expects. It does not get the payoffs from the Biden administration it expects. And it starts slow walking and really gutting cooperation. So way before Nancy Pelosi went to Taiwan, which was the trigger for the formal announcement, no law enforcement collaboration at all with the US in any area, the counter-narcotics collaboration, which was always limited, nowhere what we would want police-to-police collaboration to be, it had already been gutted. Now, in recent months, both China and US have wanted to stabilize the relationship, put a floor underneath the free fall in the relationship, stabilize the level of tension that we have been seeing between the two countries, and they resurrected counter-narcotics collaboration. We have had meetings between President Xi, President Biden, a new renewed joint counter-narcotics working group of Chinese and US law enforcement officials has met. There is some intelligence flowing. China has agreed to collaborate on money laundering, none of which has been the case before. So those are areas. So there is now more collaboration, but how robust, how extensive it will be, it all yet remains to be seen.
Thank you. We're getting near the end of our allotted time. But there is a question from Graham Lean here to both of you. What is the current extent of Chinese organized crime's impact on quote unquote normal Chinese business communities in Southeast Asia and around the world? So the extent of Chinese organized crime's impact on normal relationships. Martin, would you like to take that first?
Yes, a little bit. I think that's quite a straightforward answer. I think as both Vanda and I have sort of said, setting the scene of what Chinese organized crime involves, it's far larger than just Chinese communities. And I think traditionally or historically, you would have expected Chinese communities around the world to have been the victims of various types of Chinese criminality. Triad societies engaged in extortion, etc., basing themselves in Chinese communities. I think that's to a lesser extent now, especially as the nature of those Chinese communities in many countries have changed. Here in Britain, we have multiple generations of the offspring of Chinese immigrants, and they're pretty different from their parents in their outlook and their reactions to China. I think that's changed substantially. I think it's those macro issues that Vanda just described so well, especially in relation to enforcement action against narcotics, which is complicated. And if I could just go back to that as well, what do you do about that? As Vanda pointed out, it's simply politicized. If the US and the People's Republic of China have this relationship that's going through the floor, and Ministry of State Security is told no collaboration, then there won't be any. It's simple as that. But I do think, and going to a question from another audience member as well, there are other channels that we have to be pursuing at this time. I strongly suggest we cannot have no engagement with China. So as Stephen Grant has asked on here, how about the UNODC and Interpol? And that's a very good example. So there are entities where we can engage with Chinese organizations which are non-politicized. So I was I gave a briefing to Interpol yesterday on one of their operations, an annualized operation. 27 representatives from 27 countries on the call. That's obviously they're not all intimately collaborating together, but there is an intelligence exchange. It's different from the US DEA or customs engaging directly with the Ministry of State Security to run an operation against entities supplying fentanyl precursors. That's an organization to organization case or operation. Those are very difficult to run now, I think. But I think all of our national law enforcement agencies have to be going through those somewhat more neutral channels, Interpol, UNODC, for collaboration, but you can make personal relationships through those channels, and those relationships count. So I think that's where our immediate future lies, to try and better understand this problem, engage with the Chinese.
Good, thanks. Thanks for that. And Vanda, did you want to comment? Because then we'll start to wrap this this event up.
Just perhaps to expand on the theme of complexity. So, Chinese organized crime is a threat to Chinese communities, partially because as part of the United Front approach that the Communist Party, the Chinese government have, criminal groups are one mechanism by which China monitors and suppresses diaspora community. Actors who speak out against the Chinese government, who might be critical of the Chinese government, who might be dissidents, people who have left because they have run afoul of the Chinese government. Criminal groups, long before the emergence of informal Chinese police stations, were a mechanism of monitoring the diaspora and acting against actors whom the Chinese government wanted to punish. So part of the transnational repression that we are seeing. But at the same time, criminal groups, criminal networks, are part of what facilitates the operations of Chinese legal trade, legal engagements, legal companies abroad. They build up networks of corruption, networks of influence that might not necessarily be corrupt as well. They provide these services to legal businesses as well as to the Communist Party and Communist government. So they serve a variety of functions that translate both into a threat against some actors, some Chinese actors, some Chinese diaspora community, and serve some Chinese businesses. But also, Chinese people are victims in the scams that Martin was speaking about, enslaving hundreds of thousands of people, or at least tens of thousands of people. Chinese citizens have been victims, lured to those places abroad by Chinese criminal groups, brutalized. And when this emerges, when this becomes public, then China acts against the specific groups and puts pressure on countries like the Myanmar junta, or on militia groups that are on the border between Myanmar and China, to shut down those particular operations.
Thank you. Thanks, Vanda, for that. And Martin, thank you also for your comments, both of you. This has been a very, very interesting session, and I'm sure that the quite large number of people who have been participating and asking questions would agree with me. And so the Asia Scotland Institute is enormously grateful, Vanda, to you at Brookings, and Martin, to you. And just to point out to those that are listening that tomorrow at 11 o'clock UK time, we will be looking at climate collaboration, accelerating net zero solutions in Asia and the EU. And 4 days after that, on the 20th, we're going to look at India navigating the path ahead with the ongoing very substantial elections in India. So those are two things to mark for your calendars. And we will, I'm sure, be returning to this extremely important subject later in the year. So Vanda, thank you for being up early to join us. Martin, we're on the same time scale, so we're both okay now. It's lunchtime. And to everybody listening, thank you very much for your support and interest in the programs of the Asia Scholars, designed to increase your knowledge of Pan-Asia and to educate and inspire tomorrow's leaders to get engaged in that part of the world. So to all of you, thanks a lot.